Hello everyone, welcome to Frames Bar. Welcome to our belated Halloween party. I know this video is late and I'm sorry, I was going to have it done by last weekend, but some things came up. But then I decided that maybe it doesn't matter, maybe it doesn't have to be Halloween for us to get a bit spooky. I mean, if you're a warlock, are you just not going to summon familiars because it's not October anymore? No way, right? So here we are. But where are my manners? What can I get you to drink? I'm gonna have one of these. This is a cocktail that I came up with for a Halloween party many years ago. I actually used to be a bartender when I was a kid, and I loved mixing things and coming up with recipes. I was never any good at it, but I call this thing the Grizzly Ghoul, after the lyrics in the Michael Jackson song. And it got me thinking, what is a ghoul? It's definitely not a monster that gets top billing when it comes to like Western creatures. It's very vague what it does compared to something like a werewolf, so I looked it up. Turns out that a ghoul is a spirit or phantasm or creature that hangs around graveyards feeding on the flesh of dead humans. And I thought it was interesting because it kind of paints this picture of the ghoul as a sort of pathetic creature, it kind of skulks about at night. It's implied that it's a bit too much of a pussy to go after an actual live human, and even zombies do that. It kind of made me really like the idea of a ghoul, and I kind of want to meet one now. I did go to a graveyard on Halloween night. There is a beautiful cemetery near where I live, and I obviously didn't disrespect the place in any way. I just kind of like to take walks there late at night and kind of soak in that energy a little bit, especially on Halloween, especially when the stars are out, and I'm always on the lookout for a ghost or a spirit. I've never seen a ghost personally. I'm not entirely sure I believe they exist even though in the past, like we've talked about, I was mistaken for a ghost one time. But I would love to be proven wrong, I really would love to see something like that. But now I'm going to be on the lookout for ghouls as well when I go. I kind of imagine them, I guess, like golem-esque creatures, very pale, kind of hiding behind tombstones, maybe with big reflective eyes, kind of like a cat in the night. No luck so far. I'll let you guys know if I ever come across one. I used to be really into stuff like that. I guess I still am, creatures and folklore. And it's really interesting when you read about these different supernatural creatures in these tales, how they seem to be very specific to the country they are from. And they seem to very often be sort of cautionary tales to keep you away from the specific things that are very dangerous about living in that country. So I was born and grew up in Sweden, and in case you've never been, it's a very large country. I think it's more than twice the size of Japan, but it has 1/13 or something of the population, which means that it's a very large country and it's mostly empty. It's mostly lakes and woods, basically. And even now, but definitely back in the day, going into the woods when they're that large, when you could probably walk for weeks and weeks in a single direction and see nothing, it was very dangerous. We have wolves and bears, especially up north, dangerous creatures, rivers and lakes. So it's interesting how when you read these northern Scandinavian folk tales that date back to the age of the Vikings, it's all about don't fucking go into the forest alone. If you hear something in the forest, definitely don't go after it. Never leave the trail. Never look for something interesting that you might see in the underbrush, because if you lose your way, you might be fucked. There's this one sort of interesting demonic creature. I mean, we call them, I guess the word is väsen, which is kind of like a word for a supernatural creature or fairy. And, trolls and things are very Scandinavian. They come from old Viking lore, but there's this one creature known as Necken, who I always found kind of fascinating when I was a kid. It feels kind of Greek mythology in a way, because it's a very beautiful naked man who sits in a river on a rock playing music. I've seen the tales he's either playing a fiddle or a flute, and the music is so beautiful and the man is so beautiful that you kind of go towards him, and before you know it, you are in the water being either dragged down or away by the current. And it's a tale to tell you that if you hear something, deep in the woods, don't go after it, go straight where you're supposed to go, stay on the path, and don't fuck around, which is cool. And then, I got really into Japanese folklore and demonic creatures and sort of ghost stories and horror stories when I came to Japan for the first time when I was about 20 years old. It's really interesting because you read, classic ghost stories in the West, and you watch scary movies in the West. They usually have, even though, they have a different tone, they're usually scary, they tend to have that same sort of dramatic structure where there's a climax, but then there's some sort of conclusion or explanation or chunk of exposition at the end, or at least you get to see most of the time the main characters in the story move on. And then maybe, there's a hook for a sequel at the end, because of course Western horror also has that beautiful tradition of being very B-movie and being very schlocky, but there's usually some sort of resolution. But the interesting thing about Japanese horror films is that they tend to go towards like a really horrible climax when you're feeling the worst, and then they just end. And I started reading these old ghost stories, and I realized that it's probably influenced by them, because that's what happens in these old tales. It's always like right as the really horrible, scary thing happens, the story just ends right there, and you're left with this dread. And I think the point is for that dread to linger as long as possible. And if you just compare, the Japanese version of The Ring, for example, to the Western remake, I think that it's really clear how it's more focused on the main character and their journey in the West, where it's more about that sense of just impending doom and dread in Asian horror. Like demons and fairies here in Japan, they're known as yokai, and there are many different yokai, and some of them are really interesting, some of them are really funny, some of them are really terrifying, like what she called the Kuchisaki Onna, which is a woman who has like a horrible flesh-eating mouth hidden underneath her hair, sort of on the back of her head. Snow demons and different things that live in and around and underneath your house. But one of my favorite ones that I used to laugh about, because you look at a picture of it and it's kind of silly, it's known as the Itam Momen, which is it's kind of like a flying demonic towel. It's kind of a piece of cloth. I guess maybe it was supposed to be, one of those things, because they used to wear traditional Japanese clothing, and you have all these different kinds of cloths that you bind and use to wear your kimono or whatever. But it's some sort of, it almost looks like a long bath towel, but it's alive. Sometimes it has a couple of eyes, and it flies around in the sky looking for people to attack. So it just looks really silly and funny, but then you think about what actually happens when it finds you. It flies down and then wraps itself really tight around your face and neck, covering your mouth and nose, and then you suffocate to death. And it's only when I really imagined that happening to me that I realized that it's like one of the scariest monsters ever, right? It's really horrible. But they have so many cool, weird creatures. There's the dude with a giant eyeball coming out of his ass. I'm not making that up, by the way. If you want to look at some cool old pictures of it, Google Shirime, and And you can see that happening. But again, there's this thing, I think, of people in these old tales trying to caution people, and especially children, from the things that are very dangerous in their country. Because I was told I loved to swim in the ocean. When I was a kid, my dad, was a sailor, and we had a boat, and I used to spend a lot of my summers on the sea when I was a kid, and we loved to swim in the ocean where I'm from, on the sort of west coast of Sweden, the Atlantic coast. So I really, especially when it's summer, I really want to go in the sea. I want to dive down. I want to have that salt water sort of go in my ears and nose and my sinuses, and I want to air dry. And there's something about that is sort of beautiful and freeing, and reminds me of summer. So when I came to Japan, especially here where it's very hot and the ocean is everywhere, I wanted to go swim. But around Obon, which is this... it's kind of an amalgamation, I guess you could call it, a Japanese version of Halloween mixed with Christmas, because it's a night of spirits when you honor the dead, but it's also when everybody in Japan goes home to see their family. In Christmas in the West, it's usually a holiday where you go back and you see your family. I guess in America you have Thanksgiving for that as well. And in China, there's Chinese New Year. You always go back to where you're from, usually to your parents' house, and you see your relatives and things. Well, that's Obon in Japan, and it happens in the middle of summer, but it's also a spiritual holiday. So it's not only your living relatives, but it's all of your dead ancestors. Everybody is traveling back to their ancestral homes, and you have these fires and lanterns, and it's honestly a really beautiful and interesting holiday. Might be one of my favorites. We have these amazing matsuris and festivals here in Japan in the summer, but I was told by my friends when I came over here that I could never go swimming around Obon, because these pale ghostly hands come out of the I guess the sediment underneath the water and grab you and drag you down and drown you, which is of course horrible and sounds extremely scary. But there are all these tales of people drowning when they go swimming around Obon. So I looked it up, and it turns out that week is when there's a seasonal swelling of venomous jellyfish in Japan that can paralyze you if you get stung too much. So I had this idea that maybe don't go into the ocean because of the jellyfish might not be enough of a cautionary tale to keep the kids out of the water. So you make up these stories about ghostly hands, that it's not that your legs are paralyzed and you can't swim, it's that you're actually being grabbed and dragged to your death. As I've been reading about these different old stories, I realized that there's this huge lore that we in the West know very little about when it comes to Southeastern Asia, countries like Malaysia and Indonesia. And there's a really great old horror film that I love called Mystics in Bali. You might have heard about it. It's a bit of a cult film. And it's interesting how, Indonesian films is really interesting. I'm really into movies, but whenever I see something from Indonesia, I'm always super impressed. They make some of my favorite films. I think The Raid Redemption might be, one of the greatest martial arts films ever, might be my favorite action movie. And I also really want to recommend a horror film now that we're talking about this. If you want to see something scary this season, I know Halloween is over, but if you just want to see a really good scary movie, there's an Indonesian film that came out a couple of years ago called Impetigore. And if you're into if you really get scared and you really feel weird and bad when you watch a really dark movie, maybe don't check it out. But if you're like me and you kind of enjoy that sort of thing, I can't recommend it enough, because it is so extremely well done. Well written, well acted, but the atmosphere of the movie is amazing. And not to spoil anything, but it's about this very rural village in Indonesia that has been cursed, and all the children in the village are being born in a sort of a deformed way. And it's about a woman who travels there to try and sort of get to grips with that curse. But it's just an amazing movie, so definitely watch it if you haven't. But these old folk tales. I was reading about them, and there's this really cool creature, which is a Southeast Asian vampire known as, I think it's called a Penanggalang. I don't know if I'm saying that right, but it has different names depending on which country you go to, or which part of a country you go to. You go to Sumatra, it's called one thing. You go to Malaysia, it's called something else. You go to Thailand, it's called something else. I think on Bali and in much of Indonesia, it's known as a leyak. And a leyak, it's sort of like a vampire crossed with a witch. It's the upper torso or body of a woman with her bleeding guts sort of hanging out, and it flies through the forest at night, and it bites and sucks the blood and sort of life force out of people. And it's kind of uniquely horrible because it goes after pregnant women and sort of sucks their unborn fetuses right out of their bodies. It's just such a horrible image. But one of my close friends here in Japan, who I've known for many years, he's a video producer and a photographer, and some of the photos you've seen on me in like thumbnails and when I've done podcasts and stuff, he helped me out with that stuff. He's a great guy. But I just asked him, do you know these creatures that I've read about called leyak? And he's like, oh yeah, leyak, don't go into the woods alone. They'll get you. They're out there. I just thought, man, must be really scary, and must have been so scary back in the day, no matter where you lived, where everything that happened to you was a monster or a curse or something horrible. I mean, you read about, Europe in the Middle Ages, for example. If you get sick, it's probably a curse. It might be a demon. You lose your wallet, it might be because your house is haunted, or spirits are hanging over you. You have a nightmare, and it's an actual mare, not as a horse. A mare is it's actually an ancient Swedish word called it's something called a mara, which is this horrible little goblin dude that kind of comes to you when you're sleeping and infuses your subconscious with anxiety and attacks your chest and throat, kind of presses it down so that you have this heavy chest and you struggle breathing. So it's kind of like an anxiety demon. And the reason a nightmare is called a nightmare is it's like an actual demon coming to mess with you when you're sleeping. And even though I would really like to see a ghost or a ghoul, in a way I'm sort of happy that I don't have to be on the lookout for them constantly. In Japan there's something called neikan, which is the ability to see supernatural things and the ability to sense ghosts. And basically everybody here in Japan believes that that's a real thing. You might... people will think you're weird if you talk about believing in that sort of thing in the West a lot, but here it's basically common knowledge that some people have this neikan and they can see or commune with spirits, and those are the kind of people who do seances and fortune telling and stuff like that. So I guess my problem from a Japanese perspective is that my neikan is just zero, and maybe when I'm hanging out at night trying to find a ghost or a ghoul, maybe they're all around, but I just lack some sort of special ingredient that allows me to pick up on them. Who knows? If you have any cool experiences of your own, I'd love to hear about them in the comments. This was going to be like a short intro of me talking about ghouls, but we've gone on for a while now. I do want to get on to talking about what I usually talk about, video games and Tekken and stuff like that, so maybe we'll move on to that right now. I've had a lot of comments saying that you want me to talk about this new edition or version of Tekken that is coming out, called the Legendary Edition. It was revealed a couple of days ago, and I was going to make a video about it, but I kind of realized that there's not enough there, really, to make a video about, unless I'm going to turn into that guy who just makes a video trolling or laughing at Namco whenever they do anything, which is not entirely unappealing to me as an idea, but it's just such a blob of nothing. But this new version of Tekken 7 is going to be released or sold. It's called the Legendary Edition, and it's just the base game and 8 DLC characters. And I think the reason it rubbed some people the wrong way is that this late in a game's lifespan, there's usually some sort of ultimate edition where you get all the content that's been released so far. And that's kind of an indication that there might not be a whole lot more coming out for that game. And I think that would actually be a pretty cool idea. Tekken has a lot of DLC. It's, stages, it's characters, it's frame data, stuff like that. And if you bundle all of that and release it, I think you could actually probably get even more users picking the game up for the first time, even though it's this late. But it's 8 characters that have been picked specifically, and it doesn't include any of the other additional content. So it's just kind of weird. But then you look at the characters that they are going to release in the Legendary Edition, and it's only the 8 legacy characters, like the characters that have been in previous games. So you don't get any of the guest characters or new original Tekken 7 characters. And I thought about that because it seemed like a weird choice at first. It's like, why would you do that? But I think it's pretty obvious. I think it's because those new characters with a big novelty factor, because they're specific to this game, or because they're guest characters and people might be really interested in the properties that they come from, they are probably the characters that are most likely to still sell. The DLC characters that people are still very likely to buy. I wouldn't be surprised if people are still buying Lydia for the first time now, or getting Leroy, especially considering how good those characters are. But I don't know if they are seeing, massive sales of characters like Gonryu, for example. So maybe you can shift a couple more Gonryus by including him in some sort of bundle. And it really made me think about, there's that great scene in The Big Short. It's one of my favorite films. I love that movie. But they get Anthony Bourdain, rest in peace, into explain the idea of some of these derivative financial products. And he talks about how he gets, fresh fish in one day and he serves that on the menu for the day, but then 2-3 days later he can take whatever hasn't sold, he chops it up, with a couple of other bits, and he makes his seafood stew and he puts that on the menu. So he's transformed it into something completely different, but he's still feeding people 3-day-old halibut. Really entertaining movie, by the way. There's something about that whole 2008 housing crisis that is always, I don't know. Right when that happened, that month, I was a young economist. I was going to university, learning about these things, and I was working evenings as a salesman for a bank. And it's really weird how it went from being, a pretty cushy part-time job to have, to calling people, at night and them screaming at you with this unbridled, crazy anger because you worked for a bank. And everybody, even in Sweden, and we did take a big hit back then, not as bad as most other countries, but even back home, people were just convinced that banks were so evil and just out to get you. And don't get me wrong, they definitely are. Most banks are very, very evil. Having been in that world, I can say that for sure. Especially investment banks, especially very, non-regulated American investment banks. But it was just a weird time to be a part of that world. And I kind of every once in a while go back and watch a documentary or a film about it, because I guess it's a bit of a teddy bear for me. It's nostalgic. And something that, makes me think about the time I spent at school. But what was I saying? Yeah, so kind of like how you can take these, completely dog shit financial products and chop them together and sell them as if they were sort of diversified as something new. They're chopping together the shitty characters that won't sell in the Tekken 7 roster and giving you a new version of Tekken 7 for you to buy. And I think the only people this is going to appeal to is, people who don't already own the game or these characters. And I don't know how many of them there are out there. It's going to retail at I think $39.99 US. I looked at Steam, and that's the exact price that the base game is selling for right now. So it's essentially, if you want to buy the base game and get 8 characters included, then you can get this thing. I just hope that, because they were going to have that Evo event in in November, and we were waiting for some sort of announcement or some sort of reveal, and I just really, really hope that this isn't it, because it is so shitty that people are just going to be even more turned off of Tekken 7 than they already are. If you know, a game that you're already playing, characters that you already have, nothing changed. But you know, if they ship 10 copies of this Legendary Edition, then they will have made their money back, because Legendary Edition is probably something that an underpaid, often sexually harassed intern threw together, you know, on a Tuesday morning. But yeah, Tekken is sort of characterized lately by a lack of news and this sort of lack of enthusiasm. There's a dark cynicism permeating the world of Tekken, but it's interesting because that's the exact state the franchise was in when I picked it up for the first time. When Tekken Tag 2 had been out for a little bit too long, there wasn't going to be any more characters, any new content coming out for the game, and everybody just seemed sort of tired of it. Aris was doing his podcast back then, and you could sort of tell every time that they were visibly struggling to come up with things to say about the game, unless there was some sort of, you know, offline event happening. But those guys are also from that scene in California, that arcade scene that started to seriously die at that point as well. So everything just had this feeling of something late in its lifespan that was seriously withering. And that's when I decided that I wanted to learn about Tekken. Me and my friends were playing the game on the weekends. We were having a lot of fun. I was the worst player by far, and I wanted to understand how to beat my friends. So I had to learn. I had to learn things like frame data and characters, and the tutorials and guides that I watched back then. Things like Morning Bread and Butter from Level Up Your Game. Those videos were already several years old back then. But I didn't care, you know, I just had so much fun learning. And I guess if there had been a Legendary Edition that I could buy that had, you know, a bunch of characters in the base game, maybe that would have made sense to me back then, and I would have been interested in that. So, you know, it's not a super strange product to release in a way. It's just not exactly what everybody is hoping for right now, and there needs to be something else and something more in the works. But look at what happened to Tekken Next, you know, after Tag 2. If, you know, the ancient times were, you know, Tekken 2 and Tekken 3, I think Tekken 7 has been the sort of renaissance of this franchise and a kind of second golden age. It's been super exciting to watch. In the first 2 seasons, the game was such a juggernaut, became, you know, the biggest franchise in the world again, and everybody was just so behind and in love with Tekken. And unfortunately, as the game went on, we had this gradual souring of the attitude towards the game and the relationship between the development side and the community side. And what's interesting about that is I've been sort of paying attention to Super Smash Brothers lately. My girlfriend has a Switch. She likes the Switch, and she has Smash Brothers, and I play it sometimes when I'm over there, just, you know, casually. But if you look at the community side of that game, it's sort of in the exact same place in its lifespan that Tekken is. They just had officially their last character come out, Sora from Kingdom Hearts, and Sakurai, who's been the director of that franchise from the very beginning. This is like officially the last piece of content that he's bringing to the game, and you could tell in his, you know, his announcements that he's poured a lot of love and effort into this. And even though it is a new character that comes out and is very powerful, seems to be a strong trend across all fighting games right now. And watching the community reaction was interesting because people seem to be sort of sad and happy and grateful, and it seems to be more about the love and the memories with the game compared to this, you know, cynicism that we have in Tekken. And you know me, you know what I'm going to say about that. I think the reason it's like that with Tekken is I think the development side has been irresponsible and shitty, and I blame them. But then again, who am I to say? I don't have the perfect perspective on this, and it might be something else as well. But just something like the fact that we know for a fact that Sora is officially the last piece of content, something definitive like that, something that is clear and communicated, and people can feel like it is the end of an era and they can reminisce. With Tekken, we never really know what is going on, and then something happens all of a sudden, and because we don't know what is happening in the background, we tend to expect and dream of big things, and then something like Legendary Edition or whatever is revealed, or some sort of new online tournament, and nobody gives a shit, and the relationship sours even more. I really think transparency is just such a big deal. But Harada, our version of Sakura, he also seems to be ready to leave this project behind, seems to be more interested in working on things like marketing and esports. That's his new official role. But we've had credible leaks of a Tekken 8. We know that the next thing is going to happen, and I think much like with Tekken Tag 2, after that came the great golden age of Tekken 7. It is very cyclical. It's very Dark Souls lore in a way. There's an age of fire, and then there's an age of darkness, and then there's a re-ignition as long as there is any sort of enthusiasm behind the franchise, and there definitely is. So it's good to know that we officially have some sort of thick, girthy future for this game, and especially for me, because like I've said in the past, I get to double dip on my enjoyment of this game, because I get to play it, which I love, but I also get to make these silly videos about it, which I enjoy, I think, possibly even more. Speaking of content creation, actually, something that I wanted to talk about, I guess I'm thinking about it, it's standing out to me because I'm watching a lot of YouTube lately. And I know you guys are noticing this as well, because I know that my YouTube audience is kind of old and mature. According to the demographics inside YouTube, my viewers tend to be somewhere between 25 and 35 years old, which makes sense because you're probably Tekken players, right? I'm going to have another sip here, excuse me. But I really feel like there are two kinds of content creators on the platform, and it's like immediately obvious within like a third of a second which kind you're dealing with. And sometimes when I open a video now, I have to like hurry and close it down again, because the energy is so often so wrong that it just feels like abrasive. But you have these people who seem to be doing YouTube kind of for a goof, or at least with a sense of self-awareness, the awareness of the fact that the idea of somebody being a YouTuber in the first place is like inherently silly. The idea that you're going to sit there and talk to camera, and potentially thousands of people are going to watch it, and you can make a lot of money even potentially doing it, right? It doesn't mean that you don't really appreciate that you get to do that, and that you don't appreciate the interaction and the connection that you can have with the people who watch. But the other kind is like when you get the people who have, or at least seem to try to have, a sense of professionalism about the whole thing. And they probably have like professional responsibilities to their sponsors or the creators of whatever product they're talking about. And I think the main difference that you notice is that the latter kind is just so extremely joyless. There's this hollow joylessness that seems to permeate what they make, and there's a lack of that sort of atmosphere and vibe that I think is really the sort of basis of why YouTube and things like podcasts have become so big in the last like decade. It's not really about, I mean, it's good if you have some sort of content inside the content, a thing that you're talking about that is reasonably interesting or worthwhile, but it's only partially about that, and I think more about creating a vibe and an atmosphere. And then some YouTubers and some content creators and streamers do well, and that sort of blossoms into a culture, and then people can interact within that culture, and then you're all of a sudden building something that I think is really cool. And just think about the difference, right, about being one kind or the latter. One, you probably have a really cool job where you just get to have fun all the time and goof off, and the other one is like probably at least as stressful as any given office job. Not that I would know, but I do get that sense when I watch different content creators. It's like the difference between watching one of these, I mean, completely fucking pointless, over edited like film reviews or game reviews from a place like IGN, and watching, you know, the guys at Red Letter Media watch some shitty B movies and talking about them and over analyzing them. You know, and I definitely know which room I would rather be in and what kind of content I prefer to watch myself. I've had a lot of comments the last few weeks about what's been going on with the Blasted Salami and my friend Arya and that channel. You know, is he quitting YouTube and stuff? And that's not the sort of thing that I talk about, you know, what's going on with other people, especially not privately. But he is a friend of mine, and we talked about, you know, what was going on with him, because, you know, we're friends, and when something is weighing on you, you talk to your friends about it. But because I don't have these different social media platforms like Twitter, I didn't know that he had been saying things like, I'm distancing myself from Tekken or whatever. And again, it's for him to talk about, but he's not quitting YouTube or even Tekken, based on what, you know, we were talking about. It's just him, I think. It's more about him saying that he's giving up on the idea of ever having any sort of professional interaction or collaboration with the people who make that game. And my point was, that's fantastic, because that's obviously exactly what you want in the first place. Because you can just mainline your own culture and your own audience and do things because you enjoy them, and probably the less seriously you take it, I mean, as long as you're making an effort to do something that is enjoyable for you and everybody else, but because you like to, that's just going to make the stuff you make more enjoyable and more successful. Success, you know, shouldn't be the main objective. I think if you make something that is enjoyable to you and you build it, then people will come. And yeah, if I'm gonna do content, that's the kind of content that I want to make, you know. And speaking of that, you know, I know so many people have had it really rough, much worse than I have since this pandemic started. But the life that I have here in Japan has sort of gradually disintegrated since this whole thing started as well. And I had the virus back in January, and I had it pretty bad, and I was knocked out for almost a month, and I lost a job because of it. I've lost 3 jobs because of the pandemic in about the span of 1 year, because these places have been just shutting down or not doing any business, because what's happening, you know, this city is like a tourist town, and it relies entirely on the tourist trade, and the economy here is so weak right now that everything is just so incredibly shitty. Not to bring you down, but it's sort of doubly stressful when you're an immigrant like I am, because when you don't have a job, it's doubly stressful, because not only do you not have a job, you also lose your permission to live in a country, right? Because you're all of a sudden undesirable, and you're not generating, I guess, tax revenue or bringing anything useful to the country. Especially true in a country that is as xenophobic as Japan. I've been feeling for a while that I want to sort of move on, and really what I want to do is, I haven't seen my friends or my family back in Europe for many years now, and so much has been happening and changing with them. I really feel like I want to reconnect and, you know, re-explore my relationship with my family and my own country, at least in the short term. So I've decided that that's what I'm going to do, and I'm going to be leaving Japan around the start of next year. Really, the main thing that has been keeping me here the last couple of years has been my relationship to my girlfriend, but she's decided that she wants to go with me, so we're going to do that together, and it's going to be really exciting. So I'm looking forward to that. But in terms of like the channel and the content that I'm making, the most exciting part of it is that I'm now, you know, in my old videos, I would always start them good morning everyone or good evening everyone, and that wasn't because I had a canned phrase. It was because I had to get up at like 5 in the morning and record something before I went to work if I wanted to make something, or I had to stay up all night and do it then, because I just never had time to put the kind of energy and effort into the stuff I was making that I would have liked to, you know. But this is going to mean that I'm going to have that opportunity, and I'm really looking forward to starting actual live streams and stuff. So that's what I'm going to do. And it's not one of those things where I'm like, I'm going pro, you guys, you know, my life is in your hands now, subscribe to my Patreon or anything like that. It just means that I'm finally going to have like time and an opportunity to sort of explore that a bit and see what happens. And I think it's going to be really cool. And I don't watch many streams, but the ones that I do sometimes enjoy, when you have people who seem to be really enjoying the games they are playing and the interaction with the people who are watching, it's so cool, because like almost no matter what happens, it just adds to the enjoyability. If the game is shitty, if something fucking weird happens on camera or something happens in the chat, you know, as long as you're not taking it too seriously and trying to turn it into something that it's not, it just gets even better and better, right? And I remember when I was younger and I was playing all kinds of video games because I loved them, how much fun that was, and how much more enjoyable Tekken is when you're playing it with friends and enjoying it in that way. And I've talked, you know, to the main man when I'm back in Sweden. We've talked about meeting up and doing some offline stuff, and there are all kinds of people I want to play Tekken with and video games with back in Europe. So I'm going to give that a shot, I think, starting next year. So hopefully that sounds reasonably interesting, but again, it's not like I'm taking a plunge, you know, and leaving everything behind. It's more like I'm finally gonna have some breathing room to give this a shot, and then we'll see what happens. But yeah, I think that's gonna be it for this episode. I don't really know what this turned into. It was kind of rambly as usual, but you know, maybe that's a good thing. I'm not gonna script these going forward, because again, it's about being a bit more organic and sort of natural about it. But thank you so very much for watching it. I hope you enjoyed it. I have stuff coming for Tekken in the near future, and earlier today we had the official reveal of the next season of Diablo 3, which is my favorite Diablo game. I know it's sacrilege, but I actually prefer it these days to Diablo 2 or even Diablo 2 Resurrected, because I've played that game for so long that I know like every build, every item, unless they're going to add new content to Diablo 2 Resurrected that changes that game. It's not as interesting to me as 3, where we have a new season. But the new season, they're doing amazing stuff for the new seasonal theme and my favorite class, the Witch Doctor. So the PTR for that starts tomorrow, and I'm gonna try and have like a prototype build for the new Spider Witch Doctor up within a week or so. But I'm making stuff for Tekken, new season 4 tutorial for Eliza, a couple of things. So yeah, thank you so much for watching this one, and I'll see you guys again very soon.